Scott, let's kick right off. I mean, you've had sort of an amazing career in venture on both sides of the table. You were at Opsware, LoudCloud before, then first employee at Andreessen Horowitz. You now manage $7 billion?
10 now, yes.
$10 billion.
7 billion pounds if we want.
Well, these days it's almost the same thing. Our Prime Minister's very determined to bring us to as close to parity as possible on that. So it's kind of like, given that you seem a pretty busy guy, why did you write this book as well?
Well, first of all, thank you to EF and thanks to SVB for having us. I really appreciate it. And as was mentioned, SVB has been a great partner of ours for a long time, and obviously we're getting to know the EF team and look forward to spending more time together. And thank you all for being here. So why did I write the book? I actually, the truth is, I didn't actually intend to write a book. I did intend to write a bunch of blog posts. And the theory behind it was, having now been in venture for 10 years, and as you said, kind of also been on the other side of the table, I kept getting a lot of questions or hearing a lot of questions from entrepreneurs that were very kind of, I would call foundational questions, like literally, should I raise money from venture capitalists? Like, what does it mean? And they all had this kind of similar concern, which was basically, how do I not get taken advantage of, right? So I will not use any, kind of obscene language here since we have recording devices, but that was the basic gist of it, which is, look, like, if I do this, like, am I going to get taken advantage of? And so my hope with the book was to say, look, if we can actually try to demystify it a little bit and say, look, this is how the business works, this is what motivates the VCs, this is what the terms mean in the term sheet and all this other stuff, that if people were either on the margin about not engaging with VCs, they might be more inclined to do so, and then for those who were, hopefully they would feel like, look, we're doing this kind of from a level footing as much as we can. So that was the goal.
Excellent.
And I guess I found I had more to say than a couple blog posts, and that's how.
You realized
blog
if it had been a Medium post, it would have been like 3.5 hours.
Exactly right. That wouldn't have gone over well.
So I read somewhere that Andreessen Horowitz sees about 2,500 pitches a year, maybe more than that. So you must encounter both a lot of sort of ideas that entrepreneurs have about VC, and probably some of those are misconceptions. What would you say, like, in the aggregate, what is the biggest theme of misconception that founders have about venture capital?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things maybe that are worth talking about. So one is, it's not really a misconception, but I would say a thing that kind of I think people don't think enough about on the entrepreneur side is literally kind of good thinking around how much money do I want to raise, and I know that sounds almost obvious, but what often happens is people come in and they'll say, great, we're raising $10 million, and you're like, okay, well, why are you raising $10 million? And they don't actually say this, but it kind of feels like they're telling us, well, I'm raising 10 because my friend yesterday raised 10, and that seems like the right amount of money to raise for a Series A, and that might be the right data point, but the discussion we'd rather have is, okay, like, what are you going to try to do with that 10? How long that's going to take you? And quite frankly, what's the story and the milestones that you're going to be able to tell the next investor? And we should figure out, working backwards almost from there, is 10 the right amount of money to get you there? And it's a small thing, but I think like the more the entrepreneurs who are more kind of experienced, or at least kind of think through this stuff, it's just a much more rational discussion to have about, like, how are you thinking about that? So that's kind of one thing, which is, it's not really a pet peeve, but I would say it's things that I think entrepreneurs could do differently in many cases. The other is, you know this obviously because you're in business, but look, for better or worse in this business, we make a lot of mistakes, right? We invest in a lot of things that, unfortunately.
We've never actually made a mistake.
Right, exactly. Well, that's good. That's good. You're well ahead of the game.
Well, none of them are in the room anyway. So.
Exactly. Right. You've just whitewashed them out of your history, right? Which is another way that some firms like to do. But obviously, look, because of that, look, we make a bunch of mistakes, but for those who've been in the business for a while, we know that, look, that's the nature of the business, and this business, you're going to succeed or fail based upon that 10 or 20% of your portfolio that really does well. And so what that means then from an incentive structure perspective is every time we make an investment, we have to at least convince ourselves that it can be one of those 10 or 20% outliers, right? And I know that, again, for people who follow the business, that sounds obvious. And so the things in a pitch that might make you scratch your head and wonder about that are the things that kind of, give you pause, right? So sometimes you hear this wonderful pitch and it's great, and then they put up the financial projection slide, which again, we all know the financial projections don't really mean anything, but they are a window into your thinking at least.
Right.
And so you have this great pitch, and you're like, wow, I believe it, it's going to be great. And you see this financial projections, you're like, that feels like really that feels like it doesn't actually follow from the presentation you said. If like the market is so good and your solution is so great, like this seems fairly modest. And maybe it's just, they were trying to show us what we thought we wanted to see, which is we don't want to see some crazy numbers on a spreadsheet because they don't want us to pull it out at a board meeting 6 months later, which, hopefully we wouldn't do. But it goes to like, making sure you don't have inconsistencies in your story, right? So like if it's so great and you're raising $10 million, whatever the number is, like we'd like to at least see a plan that reflects that ambition, right? Even though we know obviously those numbers probably bear no resemblance to what will actually happen, right? Or the other one, I've talked to this before, but I think it's a good example of the same thing, which is the inconsistency of, this is great, it's an awesome business, we're going to win the market, and then, oh, by the way, don't worry, if we don't, there's 5 acquisitions, there are 5 acquirers out there who will pay, they'll pay $100 million for this business, and you're like, wait, like, that again, like these logical inconsistencies kind of, make you worry about whether you are aligned with what the incentives are for the entrepreneur. And it's not a normative statement about whether they're good or not, but it's just like going into that relationship without kind of being aligned. Those are the kind of things that kind of give you pause sometimes.
So at a really basic level, what does good look like? I mean, because you do a lot of things now at Andreessen Horowitz, but like you're a Series A firm in many ways. Or that's so it's Series A. What should my revenue look like 3 years from now? Yeah.
So I don't care what the actual number is. I think the question, so like what we want to see is, it's really your idea maze of how are you thinking about, number one, what's the go-to-market model, right? So you should at least have some articulation of, okay, look, when we get the product out there, like this is the way we're going to actually get into the hands of customers, right? And you won't know what CAC and LTV are and things of that sort, but at least a framework for how you think about that and what are the sources of paid acquisition you might be using if you're a consumer company or if you're an inside sales enterprise company, what's that going to look like? So some reflection of kind of go-to-market is really helpful. Look, obviously, a part of the job of the entrepreneur is to educate the VCs on kind of the market opportunity, right? And I think sometimes people either assume that we actually know more than we do, and we like to think that we pay attention to a lot of stuff, but I think at the end of the day, like there's lots of markets which we have no idea, and so we need that entrepreneur to kind of help us understand why the market opportunity is big enough, and then ultimately, of course, we want to hear the idea maze of, okay, given the market opportunity, how did I decide what my initial product plan is? Again, recognizing that we know that's going to change over time, and we want to kind of get ourselves comfortable that the entrepreneurs are going to be malleable enough to listen to some of that market feedback. But a lot of it is, when it boils down to, look, and you do this for a living too, is there's not a whole lot quantitative to evaluate, right? So like we don't really know what the market size is. We don't really know if the product that you say is going to actually solve the market problem. The only thing we know is we're stuck with you, right? And I mean that in the most I mean that in the most positive way, right? Look, this is your tagline, right? Talent investing, right? So then really most of it does come to that, which is okay, like why you? Like what is it about you? And I kind of think of those as them as 2 parameters, which is there's the why you on the product side, right? So what is it about your background and your team's background that makes you uniquely suited to go after this particular market with this particular product, right? And sometimes that's maybe, you experienced the problem and you just felt compelled to solve it, or maybe you've been in the industry for 20 years, you know everything about it, but something that kind of reflects the fitness between your idea and you and your team. And then the other piece is, and I hate to use this word leadership because it's such an overused word, but what is it about you that will enable people to actually follow you down a horribly scary path of starting a company, right? And go tell their spouse, I'm quitting my job. Congratulations, by the way, I'm taking a 50% cut in compensation to go join some crazy guy who, is telling me about how he's going to change the world, right? And so those are, at least that's how I think about the concept of leadership, which is how do you get people almost to do somewhat irrational things based upon your ability to articulate that vision, right? And so those are kind of the things that ultimately, like, I think as an early stage investor, you get really excited about when you're like, wow, like great fitness between them and the product and great ability to articulate a story that makes me believe at least that, people will kind of walk in tow with them.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating to me. Like we write checks that are a couple of orders of magnitude smaller than yours, but even when we're making $100,000 check after maybe the company's been alive 8 weeks, if that, maybe the founders have known each other 8 weeks.
Right, exactly.
We're still asking those questions, like why you?
So on a risk-adjusted basis, you actually write much larger checks than we do. Right, yeah.
Why you? Why now? And will people quit their jobs to work? If I could only ask one question,
that's
what would it be? That's the
question.
Quit their jobs?
Right.
Can I do a couple of things I'm sort of just personally intrigued by? Hopefully these people are too. So
we can just have a conversation between ourselves, actually.
A16Z has obviously been involved in like some like truly iconic companies. Do the ones that like the Slacks, the Airbnbs, do they wildly outperform their ambitious estimates, or is it that they knew pretty much where they were going to go and like they did, or is it like wow, everyone's surprised on the upside?
I think they do, and in fact, I was actually talking to Mark Andreessen about this the other day with respect to Facebook, right? And he's like, look, no matter, you'd be very hard pressed in 2008 or 2010 or 2012 for anybody to have imagined, obviously, what Facebook could have become, right? And so, yeah, I think that's true. I mean, Slack's a weird one, as you know, right? Because like Slack was not Slack, right? Slack was literally this gaming company called TinySpec. If everyone's heard the story, sorry, I won't bore you. But every now and then you get something like that where And quite frankly, actually, it's very interesting in the context of the last question we had, which is, I think that's why investing in talent is such an important thing, which is, look, like, certainly we thought we were investing in Stuart Butterfield to go build a gaming company, but, a lot of the thesis, we didn't know anything about the gaming company. A lot of the thesis was like Stuart, we just felt was an incredible entrepreneur, and, lucky for us, he came up with this other wonderful idea. It doesn't always happen that way, but that happens. But yeah, I think the Airbnbs and people like that, I think the thing that they can't imagine is how does the market size expand as the technology actually creates new use cases, right? And so I think that's where, again, as a venture capitalist, you can get a lot of these things wrong, which is you can kind of, as you know, look, when Airbnb started, it was literally, it was basically people sleeping on people's couches, and there was this company, Couchsurfing, at the time that had been around for many years, and it was a fine company, but it never really took off, right? And so you had to, and I give them credit, you had to have this expansive vision that, as you made it easier for people to go, stay wherever they wanted to stay, that not only was the hotel a proxy for market size, but also that you would actually expand that market. And I think those are hard, those are hard things. It takes unique founders like, Brian and team to actually figure that stuff out. So yeah, I'd like to say that, we knew it all along that Airbnb was going to be huge, and Slack, I think we all know that's not true.
So one of the things you mentioned when you were talking about like what you were thinking about and what you want the founder to articulate was almost like the next funding round.
Yeah,
And that's a framework we use as well. We're like, well, when we've helped a lot of people now raise seed rounds, and we always say like you're kind of really selling a story about what the A round is like.
Absolutely.
So it kind of raises an interesting question, which I've often wondered about. It's just like, why don't you lead the next round and the next round and the next round? I mean, there are a couple of examples in venture, like Sequoia and WhatsApp, where they did do that. But why is that so rare? I
think it's becoming less rare, actually. Okay. So yes, look, I think that is number one. And by the way, at least in the Valley, I think it's becoming, I wouldn't say it's common yet, but it's definitely less rare. And look, we could, right? So I think there's a theory, part of it is, look, at some point, just from a portfolio diversification strategy, right? You probably can't put $500 million or $1 billion of a single fund in a company. Right. And luckily for a lot of us in the business, right, we have different funds and stuff like that, so you can kind of mitigate some of the portfolio construction risk. Look, I do think there is value in some cases to having, more voices on the board and more people around the table. And so, I think that takes into account some of it. But increasingly, I think what you are seeing is this idea, exactly what you asked, which is, look, if it's so good and we like it so much, like, why aren't we increasing our concentration over time? And again, I think there's some limit to that just is, and whatever the numbers, there's some aggregate amount of money you can put in a company maybe based on your LPA, or there's some theory where it's like, look, this company needs partners who are, pan-European or something else, right? There's some skill set that people bring, but I think you will see more of that over time. And look, I think it's a fine thing, as long as, in many cases, it's valuable to the entrepreneur, which is, look, they don't want to spend the time fundraising. Right. As long as I think, you have to make sure that, number one, obviously they have a good relationship with the firm and they want you to expand your relationship. So it's not like, a God-given right that you can just actually put more money in these companies. And I think too is, look, you have to do it in a fair way, right? So look, no entrepreneur is going to give you, a deal that's off market, right? Just because you happen to be an existing investor, right? Look, to their credit, the entrepreneurs are smart enough to know not to do that, right? And so look, I don't think it's a good strategy to think you're going to kind of do something that's way off market. But I think if you say, look, we like the company, we want to put more money in, either go talk to some other people if you want to get a market check, or let's just kind of figure it out and see if we think we can get to a fair deal. So I think you will see more of that over time.
Great. So Andreesen Horowitz is very unusual, right, in the venture world. I think you were 170? 180 employees. We have 130, and we have a slightly smaller AUM base than you for now.
I'm sorry to hear that.
But it's very different running an organization.
It is,
I'd love to hear just sort of some reflections from you on, one, scaling venture, which I think before you came along, a lot of people said was impossible. How are you feeling about that, and what are the trade-offs?
Yeah, it's a good point. So I think, so you're right, historically, I think a lot of people have questions about scaling. I think, though, you have to separate scaling from kind of at least what we call kind of our operating teams, right? Which is basically, so we have 180 people, about 100 of the 180 is on the post-investment side, and they're bifurcated into about 5 different groups, and we don't have to go into the details here. But so to me, that's a different kind of scaling, which is, to me, that looks like a company to us, right? And we all come from the company side, which is, look, you have managers and people have objectives and they have metrics, right? And they have cash bonuses tied to the performance of those. And, we just literally started today, I sent out an email, we're doing the 2020 budget planning process, right? So we have a set of systems and at least a set of organizational structures that I think allow us to scale that fairly easily, right? I mean, there will be a cap at some point. Obviously, some of it's a function of AUM and management fees. Some of it will be a function of, is enough at some point in time. But that one I think of as literally you can just think about that as the same ways you would grow a company from 50 to 100 to 200 people, you have all that same infrastructure. I think the investing side, obviously, is the harder piece to think about scaling. And I don't know if we've solved the problem, but what we've tried to do is kind of basically build a hybrid system. And what I mean by that is as you know, we have a couple different funds, right? So we have kind of 3 different early stage funds, kind of crypto, bio, and then we have consumer enterprise and fintech kind of in one fund. And what we've done is we've scaled over time is to try to kind of centralize, or I guess I should say decentralize decision-making from the full general partner group and push down decision-making as much as we can to the people who are the resident experts in those teams. So, our Monday meetings are weird, right? Because our Monday meetings are, we all start together in the same room and we talk about, kind of the broad pipeline, and we talk about kind of other issues that are important for the full group. And then kind of the next part of our Monday session is we break into our vertical teams and kind of go deep dive on different deals. And we've got different thresholds as to, depending on the size of the deal, how many people do you need to approve something versus otherwise, and stuff like that. But that's the theory on scaling we're trying to get to, which is push down decision-making to the areas of expertise, keep the early stage GPs very, very domain specific, so kind of hire for domain expertise in those roles. And then we also have this later stage fund that, that we raised. There, the idea is, look, it can scale a lot easier, and the expertise you're looking for is people who have kind of growth and, kind of later stage kind of evaluation and financial evaluation skills. And then they can kind of pull from the early stage teams to get the expertise of the fintech person if we're looking at a fintech deal. So that's at least our story for how we're thinking about it. The other big question to me, right, and you and I talked about this a little bit, is geographic scaling, right? And I think historically that's been very challenging, right? So there have been some firms who've executed extremely well, but I think it's been, if you look overall, it's been a mixed record. And I just think that's a function of, look, these markets tend to be very market centric, and they're location specific, and the relationships are different. And so it's hard to imagine, in all cases, that a team sitting in China is really going to have much to say about a deal, sitting in the UK and vice versa. And so I think, historically those things have been difficult. We haven't started that process yet, so we haven't really even tackled that problem. But I think that's probably the harder problem, is to think about kind of geographic scale.
Right. Do you have a sort of thesis on Europe? And I'm particularly intrigued by, like, what would you have to see to want to do a deal in Europe?
So we don't have a thesis, I would say, and we don't have a thesis, quite frankly, on any particular geography. It's not that we would need to see something. I think it's just the reality of, look, to me, if we're going to be in Europe for real, at some point that means, okay, you have to actually have a team on the ground here. And again, given our structure, right, we have to do it in a brain consistent way, which is we couldn't just drop one GP in here and say, like, great, here's your name card, go do it, right? We'd have to think about, okay, like all these other ancillary operating functions, how would we support those companies? So, partly the reason why we haven't done it yet is not a normative statement on the attractiveness of the market, but it's literally just a practical issue, which is it's a step function in terms of complexity and cost and everything else to go do it. And at least right now, we feel like, look, there's enough running room where we are, kind of principally in the valley, that we don't need to go do it for right now. That doesn't mean we may not. But we've done a couple companies here. TransferWise is in our portfolio, and Probable's in our portfolio. My general view on this market, on quite frankly a market like Israel, we've done a couple LATAM deals of late, is if we have relationships there and we know of stuff that's interesting, like, yes, we should go get on planes that look at those things. We're definitely going to miss the seed stuff, right? There's just no way. I feel very strongly that seed is a real local market, and there's just no way. We were talking in the room before. There are some firms apparently who are doing seed stuff. I'm not sure that we feel like we can do that in a constructive way. So by definition, we will be slightly later than that. But I feel like they are markets where, again, they're close enough to the U.S. in terms of at least cultural values and rules of law and other stuff like that, that you can kind of, I guess, dabble would be maybe the word. Whereas we do feel differently about China and India, which is, look, I just think it would be very dangerous to kind of dabble in that market, right? As opposed to saying, look, we're going all in, and kind of like we're going to put a full team there. And so, I don't know what will happen over the coming years. I would say probably in the near term, I would not expect to see us do like material dropping new teams into new markets, but we'll kind of start to do some deals here to get a better feel for the markets. And then, I think over the 5 to 10 year period, it's probably more likely conversation for geographic expansion.
So maybe this one has been done to death, but I think, like, lots of people.
When you preface the question like that, nobody wants to hear the answer.
Well, I was going to say, like, I can't tell what's been done to death and what, because I've listened to 13 podcasts of you talk about your book.
Okay, sorry.
You've done to death, but maybe
this is going to be the best one.
So obviously, like, there's a lot of, people have been saying we're at the top of the market for about 10 years now. So
yes, exactly. Almost 10 years, right?
Almost 10 years.
Probably not in 09. But.
Not in 09. And I think some of the IPO issues that we've seen this year, there have been some great IPOs as well, have started to make people wonder, the fact that maybe the Vision Fund is not going to see a second time round, or if it does, it may be a little different. Like, what are your thoughts in general about where we are and what it means for entrepreneurs?
Yeah. So this may or may not surprise you, but. Look, we actually feel pretty good about where we are, to be completely honest. And I agree with you also. You've got this weird backdrop, which is if you go back, probably not '09, but basically if you go back pretty much every year after that, you will find everybody predicting that things are crazy. Somebody circulated, retweeted it the other day. I can't remember who initially sent it out, but somebody sent out an article from 2010 or something like that, or 2012. It was like it was 2010. Talking about how crazy it is that Facebook is valued more than Yahoo, even though Yahoo has 30x the number of employees of Facebook. And then the other one was something about like Google being more valuable than IBM makes no sense given that IBM has like 10x the revenue or something like that. And look, it's fun to poke fun at those articles, but look, I think the good news is people have been consistent, which is we've been predicting a new bubble and a popping of the bubble every year. At some point it will happen, and I will have egg on my face then, but at least I can take credit for having ignored it for the last 9 years. To me, the things that give me confidence are, and you and I talked about this a little bit too in the room about the UK, is if you look, number one, just about where we are in the state of technology and technology deployment. I mean, I'm sure you see this with your teams. Like we've seen, as you said, 2,500 pitches a year for the last 10 years. Like I can count on one hand the number of times where we walked out and we've been like, that's a stupid idea or that's crazy. And there are certainly things that are crazy as ambitious, right? That may never happen, but like, this is a Me Too idea. We've seen this 100 times. Like, you spend a day with, your team, you spend a day inside a venture firm, like, you can't help but just be incredibly optimistic about technology. And so from a micro perspective, we're good. And again, if you think about where we are in the technology cycle, you tend to have technology cycles. There's a great historian, a woman, Carlotta Perez, as you probably know, right, who's written about this, right? These kind of phases of technology adoption. We've really had kind of, we're still very early. iPhone came out in '07, right? The internet really, as we know it today, really, really gets you at least into the kind of mid 2000s, right? And so it tends to be that these run kind of 10 or 15 year kind of deployment cycles where we're kind of, getting the technology up and running, and then you kind of, harvest all that stuff over a 15, 20 year period. And so it still feels to me like we are relatively early from a technology cycle perspective. The other stuff, at least, is I look at comes to the macro stuff. Look, in the U.S., we've got one major overhanging issue. There's no question, which is U.S.-China. Obviously, is a massive issue, and I have no idea where that will come out. Although at least people feel more hopeful today than they were yesterday. So hopefully that continues.
It's like Brexit.
Exactly right. And look, I'm thrilled that I came to the UK, and all of a sudden we got a Brexit thing. So
you need to come more often.
I'm very, very happy that coincided with my visit. But look, if you look at the U.S. from a micro perspective, look, unemployment is at incredibly low levels. Like business spending is still very strong. Consumer confidence is still very strong. And I worry that, quite frankly, we might talk ourselves into a recession given kind of, a lot of these external issues. But it doesn't feel to me like we're going off the cliff in any respect. And look, the last thing I'll say, and I know there's probably a longer answer you wanted, is the other thing that I try to look at is, are we over-investing in technology more generally? And so, and we put some slides out on this many years ago, and I just kind of updated them the other day for an LP presentation. If you look at kind of LP dollars into the industry, or you look at kind of dollars invested, at first glance, you look at those and you're like, oh my God, that's scary, right? So in the US, for example, last year, there was $50 billion raised of LP capital. It turns out the last time we did 50 billion was 1999, right? If you look at, dollars invested, right, 130 billion, which includes Juul, by the way, which we could argue if that goes in that number or not, but still, it's over $100 billion, right? And those are very big numbers. But I think if you look at it, and I've tried to show this in some slides, is if you look at all those numbers kind of on a tech-adjusted basis, what I mean by that is like, what's the contribution of technology to the S&P 500? How has that grown over time? What's the contribution of tech to like GDP and things of that sort? It's actually a remarkably flat line, with the exception of the bubble. The bubble spikes in every category. Like you can't normalize out the bubble. But save the bubble, like, it's actually remarkably consistent. And so I do think there is an argument to at least be made that the importance and the prevalence of technology and the market size opportunities have just changed so dramatically that you would expect, yes, that there will be more multi-billion and $100 billion companies. And so I think that's part of, at least my personal view of why, I don't feel so worried about stuff. Now, you asked about the IPO market. Look, it's no question that the companies that are traditional enterprise software companies have traded much better than the companies, say, like an Uber or something. And obviously, we didn't get to see WeWork, but companies that are very big cash burners, right? I think that's actually normal. To me, that actually makes sense, which is if you believe we're in a late cycle, which people do, you would expect that, kind of you're going to have, more depressed valuations for that second category of companies than the first. So I don't think there's too much to read into that, at least right now. Now, if we have like an entire re-rating and everyone's like, okay, we thought enterprise software was worth 10 to 15x and now it's worth, 2x. Yes, like all bets are off. But it doesn't feel to me like we're there.
Yeah. It also strikes me, and obviously this is what we do, but the flow of talent into tech is just beginning. I mean, on a global macro. I mean, actually, I thought Eric Ries's introduction to your forward to your book, kind of in a way is a great. I might steal it for our LP slides. It's a great summary of our thesis, which is like there should be many more companies in the long run, and until no one wants, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, until no one wants to go work at Goldman Sachs, because it's like not cool compared to, it's just really low impact and low pay compared to, building a massive technology company. It feels like there's a long way to play.
Yeah, the other data point, which I know, I apologize to anybody who has a business school degree here, but is, there's been this, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal that came out yesterday that, business school applications are like now at an all-time low. Like, I would venture to say that's a pro-startup, argument, not an anti-startup argument, but yeah, I think you're right. And look, you see this every day, but I agree. Like if you look at talent flows, the other thing, of course, that's happened over the last 10 to 20 years is just geographic distribution of talent, right, and also access to capital in a way that didn't happen before. I mean, you've probably heard this stat, but it used to be 20 years ago, the U.S. was 90% of global venture capital, right? It was the only real market, quite frankly, and today that number is 50%, and like that's a big change, and certainly China obviously is a big portion of that number, but there's no reason to believe, like, if we're having this conversation 20 years from now, that like we shouldn't have more entrepreneurship and hopefully more startup success and more capital, and not just in like New York, Boston, San Francisco. Like it just doesn't make any sense, kind of given kind of where we are from a technology perspective.
Can we talk about crypto for a bit? So you obviously have a crypto fund, and Mark and Chris and others were like very like early vocal kind of intellectual forces in sort of extolling this. What is your kind of current view of the market? In particular, how has it evolved since that kind of crazy December 2017 peak? You obviously sticking with it. What is exciting right now?
Yeah. So first of all, we are sticking with it. As you mentioned, we raised a fund. So here's, I think, the way to think about the state of the market is what we now know, which I think, quite frankly, a lot of people did know, but it's good now. We know in the U.S., for any of you who follows this, look, the SEC, which is the regulatory agency that governs a lot of these things. They've made it very clear is, look, if you are basically going to try to raise money in order to go then build out a network that doesn't yet exist today, if you do that, that is what we call a security. And therefore, like, you can't do that unless you register it or unless you have some exemption, right? That's the rules. Those haven't changed. I think everybody intuitively knew that, but obviously I think there was a lot of that big ICO boom you saw in 17 was people who were, I think arguably, trying to create a new definition of securities that I think rightly so the US government has recognized doesn't make sense. What we still don't know, the big gray area we don't know in a regulatory perspective is if I raised money and I built something and then now I'm ready to go actually launch my network and it's going to be a decentralized, let's assume it'll be decentralized in kind of a typical blockchain fashion. We don't yet have great clarity on is that token that now is kind of circulating there, is it a security or not, and what it means. And obviously the UK has similar questions as well. So it'd be great to get clarity on that. We are, kind of spending time with government officials to try to get them to do that. It's a little bit of gray area. I think that has definitely caused some companies to delay their launch for a little bit. So that's, I think, had an impact in terms of kind of, it hasn't stopped startup formation. It's still actually very, very, at very consistent levels of what we've seen in 17 and 18. But it means that a lot of the companies who raised money in 17 and 18 who had planned to launch, I think they're hoping to get some better clarity on that. So I would say, look, we have seen fewer launches than, quite frankly, we would have forecast. We might have, I think, due partly because of like people not exactly sure what the regulatory side is. But the broader thesis, to us at least, we believe is still intact, which is the whole original thesis on it was that think of crypto almost as kind of the free market antidote to concerns about centralization of power in the kind of platform market that exists today, right? And this is not a political statement, and it's not a statement about whether Facebook or others, kind of are doing anything wrong. But there is a recognition, I think, among kind of developers that, okay, we have this kind of precarious relationship with the platforms, right? At the beginning, they're great, and we love them because they help us acquire customers. And then at some point in time, it's potential that incentives change. My partner, Chris Dixon, you've talked about, has this great kind of S-curve post that he's done on kind of how, the incentives change over time. And so I think in that way you can think of crypto as, okay, if you could create platforms that were by definition decentralized and therefore the governance was open and people knew what it was, developers wouldn't worry that, okay, like, on a whimsy, somebody could change kind of the terms of service or change their platforms. And so that's kind of always been our big thesis on crypto. And we still believe that, and we still believe that's kind of reflective of what's happening in the community. And we're still investing. So hopefully we're right.
That's great. Okay, so I want to make sure we leave time for some questions for the audience. Sure. So last question from me, which is sort of really just inspired by what you were just saying about the platform. So one bearish take that you occasionally hear people make about startups today is any market you name, either Amazon or Google or Facebook or whoever is going to win it. There's no, great, you can have a nice talent acquisition to those guys. Yeah. One, what do you think about that? And two, to the extent that I assume you don't agree that's true, what are the areas that are most exciting given where we are with those platforms?
Yeah, you might not be surprised to hear that.
Yeah, stops are over, says Andreessen Horowitz.
Yeah. Well, and look, even more seriously, and look, I've heard that meme many times, and quite frankly, as I've told you, I've been in DC a lot, and that meme is definitely there. There's no question.
Right.
I just don't think first of all, I don't think the data supports it, right? So as I said, look, kind of if you look in terms of LP inflows and you look at dollars invested, and you look at the number of seeds in the U.S., we're doing 8 times the number of seed investments that we did 10 years ago. There's nothing to suggest to me that VCs are kind of going back to their yachts and not going to be investing money. So the data I just think doesn't support it. I think the other thing too is, yes, it's probably true, right, that, okay, if somebody came to you today and said, hey, I want to build a new AdWords platform, yes, okay, probably nobody's going to fund that business. And there's quite frankly probably good reason why you wouldn't fund that. But, if you look at the history, right, there's always things at the margin that people are doing that, kind of may not be directly in the heat, of those companies, but that are relevant. I mean, to me, the most interesting thing, if you look at Amazon, is people have consistently found kind of areas where they feel like Amazon doesn't actually kind of provide the best thing. So, whether it's, Chewy.com, right? Pet foods, people have figured that out. We were an investor in Zulily, right? Which is women's and children's clothing. And, we knew, a big concern was Amazon risk. It turns out it's just not an area that Amazon does well, right? I mean, if you're starting a company to kind of sell toilet paper tomorrow, that's probably not a great idea because my guess is Amazon's going to have a price advantage there. It's interesting in the US, I don't know if you see it here as much, but there's this whole rise of these direct-to-consumer, kind of almost like health-related companies, right? Hims and is it hers? I can't remember what the other one is, but all these things, right? And again, I think those are direct. At least we'll see if they all work or not, but they're at least indications. Number one, that VCs are funding things and entrepreneurs are starting things, even though one might argue that e-commerce is dead. Amazon's the only person who could ever win e-commerce. And look, you see this in kind of areas of social networking and stuff like that. So I think that my personal view is I think it may be the case that new company formation in the U.S. by the data is actually down. I think, though, that you got to remember, as look, most new company formation in the U.S. is not venture capital formation, right? Venture capital formation is a tiny, tiny fraction. My personal view is, and I don't think the regulators like to hear this, is post-Dodd-Frank, it became very difficult in the U.S. for, we used to have a very robust kind of community banking system and small business loan banking system. And just because of increased capital requirements and reserve requirements, it's factually the case that banks did much less lending, particularly to small and medium-sized businesses. And so if I think we have a problem in the U.S., I think it is that, yes, the non-venture capital sources of financing for new company formation still are probably not at levels where they should be. But yeah, look, I mean, I don't know if you see something different here, but I just think this theme that nobody's funding companies and nobody's starting companies, to me, I just don't think there's any evidence to show that that's true.